Welcome. My name's Turbo Huang. I'm an 11th grade student from Shenzhen, China, and it's an honor to be presenting to you my research project, Who Controls US Politics? An Investigation of Endorsements in Midterm Elections. It's difficult to understate just how globally fascinating and impactful American politics is, and every unprecedented development during the tumultuous Trump era, we could say, has only deepened my interest in both the rapidly evolving American political atmosphere, as well as the politicians that dominate that atmosphere. This presentation will summarize my investigation into the continued influence of two pivotal figures in American politics today, Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders, through dissecting the effects and rationales behind their endorsements in American midterm elections. We will begin with a quick summary of the status quo of endorsements in US politics, then a presentation of our methods, and finally a discussion of our results and their potential implications for the state of American politics today. To begin, let's take a look at the many background events in America that motivated my research. One way Trump's presidency was so unprecedented, out of many ways, was in the staggering 551 candidates he endorsed for Congress during not only his 4 years as president, but also after, maintaining his influence far after his presidency on the Republican Party. Trump today continues to enjoy enormous, even though somewhat declining, support among Republicans today, but with his support among Democrats never passing above single digits amidst greater political polarization, is his support, we have to ask, a blessing or a burden to the candidates he endorses? Who does Trump endorse anyways, and why does he do it if it doesn't help these candidates in general elections? To answer these questions, we look at a figure directly across the aisle in American politics, Bernie Sanders, the representative of a rising wing of left-wing democratic socialist populism in the Democratic Party, and a figure directly juxtaposed to Donald Trump in many ways. One way, for example, is in the ideological rather than personal influence he exerts with his progressive platform and ideas. Looking at the endorsements of these two representatives of modern American politics might just reflect the conflict between the ideological and personal influences that the two politicians exert. Whereas Trump, we hypothesize, endorses pragmatically for personal gain in states which are politically advantageous to pad his own record, our hypothesis was that Sanders was the complete opposite of that. He endorsed for ideological. He endorsed ideologically to advance his political progressive platform. The first step in our research was data collection. We limited our time frame to the 2018 and 2020 midterm elections only, focusing on several fundamental variables when looking at each candidate endorsed, such as, for example, the political leaning of the candidate's state or district, or the bachelor's attainment, which basically formed a political picture on where these endorsements went. In this scatter plot for Trump endorsements we show on the right over here, we see that the most concentrated area of the data, marked in blue, dark blue, is below average for both income and education level in terms of bachelor's degree attainment, both of which are very good indicators for Republican-leaning states. To better visualize this, we plotted two of the variables we just mentioned, so political leaning and bachelor's degree attainment, on these chloropleth maps of the US we show on this slide. So the two maps we see above are Trump's and Sanders' endorsed states' political leanings as measured by TVI, or the partisan voting index, which quantifies basically the victory margin of a party in the state on average. So the map goes on a spectrum from dark blue, where Democrats win overwhelmingly by 25% on average, to dark red, where Republicans win by 25%. As we can see, the map on the left, representing Trump's map of endorsed states, are overwhelmingly Republican leaning. Basically, all of his states are either red or purple, most of them being 10% Republican leaning or more. While in contrast, on the map on the right, at the top, Sanders' endorsement map, we see a much more, or at least relatively even, red and blue distribution instead of basically a monochromatic range of red and purple. We see a very similar trend with bachelor's degree attainment in the states the two candidates endorsed in. So in the bottom left map, Trump's endorsement map, we see predominantly yellow or light green, indicating a below the national average bachelor's attainment rate, while in Sanders' map, we basically see an even distribution. There's every sort of attainment from yellow, which is the lowest, roughly 20%, to maybe even dark blue, which is 45%. So the initial conclusion we arrive at here through these maps, in light of our hypothesis, was that Trump's endorsements exhibit a very strong correlation with the political leaning and other factors of a state. He deliberately avoids endorsing, as we can see on these maps, in highly educated Democratic strongholds like Massachusetts or Vermont, while in contrast, we see that Sanders, relatively speaking, doesn't exhibit this sort of tendency. So to confirm this observation through database analysis, we used a logistic regression, a binary regression, to determine how much each of our fundamental variables we mentioned, how much they determined whether or not a candidate would be endorsed by Trump or Sanders. So as shown in this table on the right, the PVI of a state was the largest determining factor of Trump's endorsement at 55%, while bachelor's attainment, as we can see over here, comes second at 28.2%. So this model was 95% accurate when it came to repredicting Trump's endorsements. But in significant contrast, this model, the fundamental variable model, was only 60% accurate when it came to repredicting Sanders' endorsements. But when we added this new factor we called progressivity, or the percentage of a candidate voting for a progressive political position in Congress, if they were already an incumbent in Congress. When we added this factor into our analysis, the accuracy for Sanders endorsements rose to roughly 80%, so much more accurate when compared with just fundamental variables. The takeaways we can make from this model are twofold. First, that Trump does endorse almost solely based on these fundamental variables we mentioned, which decide the politics of a state and whether a state leans Republican or Democratic. And second, that Sanders endorsements can be much better explained by the individual ideologies of each candidate, whether or not they support a progressive political position, rather than the innate political ideology of each state. So where these endorsements go are one thing, but what do they actually do? Well, as the answer turns out, surprisingly very little, or even almost nothing. Our support vector machine model, another type of binary classification, investigated the contribution of each of our fundamental variables, including, as we mentioned, the education level, as well as the political leaning of each state towards the election result. We also included, of course, endorsements in this analysis, and found that endorsements only contributed a relatively minuscule 11% to the result of an election, behind over 70% contributed by both PVI and education level combined. Besides the takeaway we can make here that endorsements will ultimately matter fairly little in midterm elections, this also justifies our hypothesis that Trump endorses in states where his candidates can win, that are politically advantageous, because PVI and bachelor's attainment were also, coincidentally, the top two contributors to getting Trump's endorsement in the first place. Let's briefly conclude this. So to briefly conclude what we talked about earlier, we confirmed the sort of pragmatic ideological dichotomy in endorsements between Trump and Sanders. Whereas we summarized Trump's endorsements as being nearly completely dictated by whether or not his candidate can win and by political factors concerning the political ideology of a state or district, Sanders' endorsements are much better characterized by the individual ideologies of each candidate he endorses. We also showed that endorsements had surprisingly very, very little effect on midterm elections in general in the US. In part, maybe due to how the same endorsement, for example, by Trump, can both galvanize support from the Republican Party and also alienate voters from the Democratic Party who don't support Trump at all. Despite these conclusions, and despite the progress I've made on this project, I do feel like I've only skimmed the very surface of the complex topic of endorsements and US politics as a whole. For example, what other types of endorsements exist, like transactional endorsements that are political favors to other people? Do Trump's endorsements have much more impact on Republican primaries where he has a lot more support? And what happened, maybe most importantly, in 2022, just last year, when the very astonishing midterms with the red wave that never materialized, and when Trump's endorsed candidates all basically lost their elections? And can our endorsement-based model serve, at least in part, to explain these trends? All of these, and much more really, are worthy of a lot more future research, but for now, thank you very much. I'd like to thank both my mentor and my audience for listening to this presentation, and that will be all. I'll be open to any questions.
Thank you, Turbo.
Mm-hmm.
That was really exciting, and thank you for that energetic and insightful presentation. And we do have a couple of audience questions. And did I hear someone unmuting themselves and speaking up? If not, let's just jump to the audience questions we received in the Q&A. So the first question is, how Trump's record endorsing people compares in terms of the sheer numbers? You mentioned he was prolific to other presidents.
Mm-hmm. So I don't know the exact numbers. I don't have the exact numbers on hand, but I can definitely say with some confidence that Trump was a more prolific endorser, as you say, than other incumbent presidents during even our era. For example, compared to Obama or compared to Biden, especially. I think the comparison between Trump and Biden is especially evident in terms of how much endorsements they're making during their presidency. So I mentioned the figure that Trump endorsed, 551 people, both during and after his presidency. When you compare this with Biden's statistics, I think he only endorsed like 3, maybe not even. It's a figure that's extremely small. So when you look on Ballotpedia and search for, all the candidates Biden endorsed during the 2022 and 2020 election cycles, it's a very, very small number. It's definitely, many, many times smaller than this enormous 551 figure that describes Trump's number of endorsements. And I think one of the main reasons, at least, why Trump is such a prolific endorser is, maybe it really does connect back to the central focus of this project as a whole, as well as the hypothesis we've been coming back to throughout the presentation. So we've been emphasizing how much Trump likes to pad his own record by endorsing in a pragmatic fashion. That is, he endorses candidates which he knows can win, and he knows that these candidates, when they win, will enforce his status as the undisputed leader of the Republican Party. And Trump's, many, many endorsements, the reason why Trump endorses so many people, I think, is maybe primarily connected to the purpose of these endorsements in creating a legacy for Trump as like the leader of the Republican Party, and in proving that he's the most influential figure in the Republican Party. And that's the reason why Trump endorses so much, compared to maybe Obama, Biden, other incumbent presidents. I think there's also something to be said, I'll keep this very, very brief, that endorsements as a whole have only become a very, very significant political phenomenon in recent times because of social media. So if you look back, during maybe the Bush era, the 2000s, the 1900s, endorsements, presidents were never this prolific when it came to endorsing candidates in midterm elections. And the rise of social media contributed a lot to candidates being endorsed more significantly by incumbent presidents as well as other politicians. I hope this answers the question.
Definitely, and I believe you also answered the other question about whether or not Trump has been playing the odds. So with that, Turbo, we'd like to thank you for all the work you've done and the great presentation, and for answering all these questions. And feel free to reach out and ask more questions in the Q&A if any of the audience questions have more questions. All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Turbo, so much.